You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Welcome back to Bookstorm Podcast, book lovers. And as always, we bring you the very best books, the very best authors. We have one with us today, Don Bentley, and he's writing for Tom Clancy in this fantastic novel that you're going to want to pick up called Weapons Grade, releasing the same time as this podcast on September 5th. Get out and grab it. Don, welcome to Bookstorm.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
We're super excited to dive down deep into this novel. But before we do, we like to give a little bit of your bio, just so people know. And your bio actually is very fascinating and shows the reader exactly why you deserve and belong writing a book like this. So Don Bentley is the New York Times bestselling author of, as you know, the Matt Drake thriller series, which we all love. He also writes in the Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan Jr. universe with this latest book, Weapons Grade. And here's why. Don spent a decade as an Army Apache helicopter pilot, during which time he was stationed in South Korea, Germany, and Texas. While deployed to Afghanistan as a troop commander in support of Operation Enduring Freedom 6, he was awarded the Bronze Star Medal and the Air Medal with a V device for valor. Congratulations.
Thank you.
He also worked as an FBI special agent and was a member of the Dallas office SWAT team. Wow. And as if this isn't enough, he's worked for companies that develop technology for U.S. Special Operations Community. He has a BS in electrical and computer engineering from Ohio State, an MFA in writing popular fiction from Seton Hill. And his writing has a lot of accolades and a lot of endorsements, and I'm going to name just a few. Great Mysteries and Thrillers, Book Trib, Kirkus Reviews, The Real Book Spy, Suspense Magazine Best Books, Thriller Award Best First Novel, Military Family Magazine as a book club pick. Wow, hard-earned and well-deserved, and welcome to Bookstorm.
Thank you. That was kind of intimidating. My wife always says that I couldn't figure out what I wanted to be when I grow up, and that's probably a lot closer to the truth, but I appreciate that.
It all fell in together. It's a fantastic resume, and I just knew from this book that you had some expertise and knowledge because it's pretty cool. Can't wait to talk about it.
I thank you for that. I think when my very first book came out, that was called Without Sanction, in my Matt Drake series, I had an interviewer once ask me, are you Matt Drake? And I said, I am absolutely not Matt Drake, but I have stood in the same room with men who could be. And that's been what I've been really fortunate, is that a lot of my characters are based on actual people that I've been fortunate enough to know. And so it's fun. I think hopefully it brings a little bit more veracity to the writing, and it's really fun for me as a writer because I sprinkle a lot of their real names in the book. So ton of fun.
Great.
Well, we love it. Well, we're here to talk about Weapons Grade. And as Chris mentioned, we loved this book. First of all, anything that involves, nuclear secrets and secrecy and conspiracies, we love those books. But in this story, it centers around Jack Ryan Jr., the president's son. And these are beloved characters. He witnesses an accident on a dark night on a Texas road, and he quickly realizes the accident was a professional hit. Now, Jack Ryan, being who he is, he debates whether or not he needs to get involved, but he's not going to let an injustice go by without taking some kind of action. That's just who he is. Now, he has just one lead. There was a meeting that the victim was on the way to, and Jack Ryan Jr. shows up instead. He meets a woman, Amanda. He learns a little bit about what's going on in this Texas town, some dark secrets, especially one involving a college student who had vanished.
Hmm.
And he decides to get involved. He's got a lot of questions. Why did somebody stage this to look like a drunk driving accident? Why did this happen? But particularly, why are there South African mercenaries who are conducting a hit in the middle of Texas? Now, the answers to these questions, of course, unravel across this incredibly gripping story, but they are leading us up to this incredible international conspiracy. And this is one that may just take Jack Ryan Jr. down. Would you like to add anything to that background? I know it's hard to not give away spoilers, Don.
No, you did a great job. I think this is my fourth Tom Clancy novel, and actually my last one probably for a while. I now have the starting next year. I'm taking over the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp series for Kyle Mills, and so I'm working on my first Mitch Rapp book now. But when I sat down to write this, my previous Tom Clancy book had been a big kind of epic sprawling book. And so I told my editor, I said, I want to write something that's a little bit more narrow or focused. I live in Texas. My son actually goes to Texas A&M University. And so I spend a lot of time driving back and forth and seeing all these little Texas towns. And so I told him, like, I want to write something that's in this little Texas town. And he's like, kind of like a Jack Reacher, but in Texas. I'm like, yes, exactly. And so that's what he thought I was going to write until about a month before the book was due. And he said, hey, I've got some covers for that little Texas town story. And I said, well, actually, now there's a whole angle about the Iranians getting nuclear breakout. And so it's a little bit bigger story than it was before. And so fortunately, this is our 8th book together, and he was good with that. But, you know, all levity aside, they're actually part of what kind of spurred this story in me is there is a current unsolved case about a tragic student from Texas A&M going home and never arriving there. And so they found his car, pieces of his clothing, and still have no idea what happened to him. And it's just was so out of place, number one, of this part of Texas, that something would happen to that. And then number two, me as now having 2 kids in college, I just couldn't imagine what the parents were going through. And that really helped spur this story as well. So thanks for that excellent recap.
Absolutely. And, and what you mentioned, that gives your story so much heart. There's just so many layers here. And now I can see a little bit of what was motivating some of that. So thank you. Well, Chris, why don't you go ahead and kick us off and ask a question?
Yeah, we loved it. So, of course, everybody loves Jack Ryan Jr., the son of the president, but who is opposite from the president in many ways. So I'm going to quote, he worked for an organization that did not officially exist, doing things that did not officially happen. And is there anything better than someone who does good deeds in secret without the notoriety? We like him right away. But then this happens. Jack thinks this, I'm going to quote again, about the choices he'd made, opportunities he'd seized, and those he let pass him by. Maybe he could start living today in a way that produced fewer regrets tomorrow. Wow. I think that's a little wisdom from Jack Ryan to all of us. But how does Jack accomplish this feat? Or any of us in the real world? Because we don't want Jack to live any quieter or less risky or less brave. And maybe any of us. How do you get around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of goes back to when I started writing the series 4 books ago with Target Acquired. I really sat down and tried to put myself in Jack Ryan Jr.'s shoes. And so everybody knows kind of his iconic father, Jack Ryan Sr., that, you know, so many movies have been made about in the books. And what Tom Clancy did, I think, was really unique at that time. And frankly, now is that Jack Ryan Sr. was a family man. He had a wife he loved. He had, you know, a couple little kids. And that was really different from a thriller protagonist, right? If you contrast that with kind of the James Bond image of, you know, the one man chasing as many Bond girls as he can, and just the duality there. And so when I started thinking about writing the son, and again, my son, like I talked about earlier, is in his senior year of college. He's about to be commissioned as a Marine Corps officer once he graduates. And so I spend a lot of time now thinking about the relationship between sons and fathers. And I thought, you know, if I'm Jack Ryan Jr., at this point in my father's life, who I admire greatly, he had a wife, he had kids, he had family. He had put that first, sometimes ahead of his career. And I'd have to think that Jack Ryan Jr. as the son would be at a point in his life where he's reflecting that I've accomplished all these things, but there are still gaping holes in my life. There are things like a wife, a family, things that were very important to me that aren't there. And so as a writer, what you're always trying to do, number one, is give the reader what they want, give them a great story with the heroes they love. But at the same time, I think in order to keep it real, you have to allow the characters to grow. And so that first question kind of came out, and Target acquired that book. And now 4 books later, you see Jack Ryan Jr. going through this thing where he's growing professionally and trying to figure out who he is. And so it certainly is a line you have to walk, because like I said, you don't want him to say, you know what, this is good enough, I'm going to become an accountant now, because that would be a little boring to write about. But at the same time, I think readers resonate with veracity that they see in the book, both from, did you get the details and tactics and all that stuff right? But also they want to see a reflection of a person they understand. And I think his struggle to balance work and career and family and all that is something that each one of us has to deal with as well.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you're bringing up your own kids, because I also loved this about Jack. He was marrying Liz Ann, who was requesting custody of her teenage niece, and Jack was all in. And right away, I'm like, what a cool guy this is. And he said, the fortitude of raising a teenager made the profession of espionage look like a fairly straightforward vocation. And I had to laugh at that. And I thought, I bet you as the author, it doesn't have to be a teenage daughter necessarily, although they can be worse. You obviously live with some teenage kids in your lifetime.
Yeah. So I have 3 kids. My oldest 2, like I said, my son's a senior in college. My oldest daughter is a sophomore in college. And then my youngest is a junior in college. And so there's a teenage daughter here that shares a lot of the same traits as my daughter. But honestly, what drove that more for me is 2 of my friends that I look up to a lot. One married a friend of mine and went from being a bachelor to instant parent of 2 teenage boys. And I watched him navigate that really well. And there were times where we'd have a conversation. I'd say, listen, man, my kids are my blood. I've had them my entire life. And there are moments in time, when I want to rip my own hair out. Like, it's okay to feel that way about 2 teenage boys that you just inherited and have to be instant father to. And then to another young couple that we're very close with at my church. They're in their very early 30s. Just took her niece, which are 2 teenage boys that were in a really bad spot. And so these 2 30-year-olds who've only been married 8 or 9 years are now instant parents to a freshman in high school and a 7th grader, I think now 8th grader. And just the way that they have done that and been willing to lean into that, to do, just was inspiring. And it really drove something in me to think, how would, in thriller writers, especially this kind of thrillers, it has a very heavy male audience. And part of that is because as a guy, you want to see somebody on the pages that you would aspire to be. And so when I thought of these 2 men who leaned into instant fatherhood to 2 children that weren't there, I'm like, man, I think that's what Jack Ryan Jr. would do. I certainly hope that's what I would do. And so it became part of the story as well.
Yeah. Thank you for adding that. It really was special.
Don, I want to go in a little bit of a different direction and ask you about something. There's a line in your story that says, and I'm going to quote, "The world's largest state sponsor of terror was on the verge of gaining a weapon that would allow its fanatical leaders to make good on their promises to incinerate their Jewish neighbors and bring about Armageddon." Your story shows us that really current state-sponsored aggression has some very deep and ancient roots. And I was thinking that compromise and modern-day negotiations may not be sufficient to get to, the bottom of some of these deeply held beliefs. And I just wanted to ask you, do you think it's important for us to really understand that historical and maybe faith-based context for modern-day political actions?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So there's a portion of the story that involves, like I said, kind of Iran reaching nuclear breakout, achieving weapons grade uranium for a nuclear bomb. And the way that that's conveyed in the story is through a Israeli special operations team that is in Iran and discovers it. And so for about the last 10 years, like you said, my bio, I was fortunate enough to work in a number of companies who marketed and made technology for special operations customers. And many of the folks that I worked with were Israeli. In fact, my last, when I had a full-time job, I worked as the vice president of engineering for the wholly owned subsidiary of an Israeli company. And so when you get to see that part of the world through the eyes of the people who live there, you know, one of the times we were having a meeting and the two Israeli founders were here with us in Texas, and it was when the Palestinians were raining down rockets on Israel, and they're literally getting WhatsApp messages from their wives and kids showing rockets arcing over their houses as they're sitting in a board meeting with us in the middle of Texas. And it just really changed something in me. And I think, you know, one of the things that we have to do is to take dictators at their word. So when they tell us they're going to do something, we need to believe them. And whether you look as far back as 2 years ago when Putin said, "Hey, I'm going to invade Ukraine," or you look all the way back to World War II when Hitler made his designs very, very clear on Europe. And for a long time, the West tried to placate him and hope that it would go away. I think you can look at the same thing in Iran, where when the leader of Iran stands up and says, "We're going to incinerate Israel," or "We're going to push the Jews into the sea," we would be fools not to believe them when they say that. And certainly if you're Israel, if you're on the receiving end, they don't have a choice but to believe it, because their very survival as a nation and as a people depends on that. And so that's something the characters who are in that section of the book, the Israeli Special Operations Team, are all named for actual Israeli friends of mine, and several of them were on a special operations team when they were in the IDF and doing their mandatory service. And so that's something Israel in general, and then that theme in particular, are very, very important to me and show up in my writing quite a bit.
Yeah, and I liked how your characters all showed the importance of understanding that bigger picture perspective, the context of history, of faith grounding.
I definitely see this in this story. You can tell that there's a lot of facts going on in this book. This is not all fantasy, that you've had experience, did some research. And one of my favorite things is this Corvair. So for the reader, it's an unmanned combat vehicle that travels from sonic to supersonic while avoiding catastrophic events. The detail that you included in this Corvair showed the reader that you did some research. I had to ask you, from your own knowledge, which pieces of this which you call it an airplane, a flight aircraft, are factual. Now, Bob said, and I had to think this was interesting, though his aircraft seemed tame right now, a wild beast lurked in her soul. So when you start talking about unmanned aircraft, for some of us, it gets a little scary.
Yeah, so that was one of my always the fun parts about writing a Clancy book, is you get to delve into an area of technology that you find really interesting. So as you said, I was an Apache pilot. I'm a huge aviation geek, and one of the things that I've always loved and interests me is planes that fly really, really fast. And so certainly the one that currently flies is the SR-71, and I got to bring that back in this book, which was a lot of fun. But I also looked at the area of hypersonics, and specifically hypersonic flight. And so there's a startup company in Atlanta called Hermeus that is actually doing work on this very thing, where their end goal is to have a hypersonic jet airliner, so a jet airliner that travels Mach 5 or Mach 6. But they're using government contracts to kind of fund some of their research. And so they just got a big award from the U.S. Air Force specifically to develop the kind of vehicle that I talk about. So an unmanned aerial vehicle, kind of like most people are really familiar with the Predator. So imagine something like that, but it can fly at Mach 5 or 6. And so in order to do the research, what was really, really fun is Hermeus has this fantastic podcast where they have their engineers on, and then sometimes they bring subject matter experts. And one of the subject matter experts they brought on was a former SR-71 pilot named Bob Bear, who coincidentally has the same name as that character in my book. And so after seeing that podcast, I reached out to him, and I spent an hour and a half on the phone as he ran me through what it was like to fly the SR-71, what actual combat missions were like. He was an Air Force test pilot and just an incredible guy. And so when I got done, I said, can I name this character for you? And he's like, yeah, that'd be great. And so I put him in there, and now I have to say that when he got the way he's introduced, the very first sentence is, Bob was a dinosaur. And so he wrote back as soon as he got that sentence, and he's like, my wife is never going to let me live that down. You called me a dinosaur. But he's a fascinating guy, and the detail, some of the things I'm sure I still got wrong, but the detail in there about how the SR-71 worked, how the hypersonic flight works, much of that came from conversations with Bob. And in fact, there's an incredible journalist named Alex Hollings who writes for Sandbox News and does these great Popular Mechanics, these great aviation specials. And he is actually going to interview Bob and I together jointly to talk about the book. And then Bob's incredible. Bob retired as a Air Force general. And so he's going to talk about Bob's career and flying those incredible airplanes. But it was really, really fun.
Wow, that sounds incredible. And this unmanned vehicle. So a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of listening to the head of cybersecurity for the Pentagon. And she said to our group that in the future, we will not own an automobile. We will all schedule, like we have Uber all of a sudden right now, but it won't even be a driver. You will schedule your pickup and drop off. And I was the person in the audience going, no possible way. And now here it's sort of, here it is in your story. Do you see some of these aircraft, these military aircraft coming down to pedestrian use, like regular use for everyday people?
Yeah. So again, there are a number of startups who are doing really interesting things where there's another one that's on the tip of my tongue that I can't think of, that is doing a electric vehicle that takes off like a helicopter and then flies for something like, maybe you look at the kind of the 200-mile radius. And so what they're trying to do is to be able to bring the cost point down to, more like a commercial flight, or maybe slightly less than that, where you literally can, as you're saying, kind of reserve your spot on that vehicle and take it from point to point that way. And so I don't know, I love things like SpaceX and Blue Origin and everything. And just love those companies that are pushing the envelope, that are doing the things that up until now we thought were science fiction and trying to make them science fact. Now, many of those won't achieve their goals. But I think one of the great things about it is it sets, people like me on fire. But more importantly, my daughter, who's in college, is an engineering student. And I think the kids her age need something like that gets their blood going. That's like, man, I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of, like what you're saying, the first driverless car or the first airplane that goes, hypersonic and can take you from here to London in an hour and a half or something. It's those big challenges, those big, crazy goals, I think, that really motivate the next generation of STEM folks to take those challenges up.
Mm-hmm. And just when we think everything's been invented, I have a crazy feeling we haven't seen anything yet.
I think you're probably right.
Don, there's an awesome scene in Weapons Grade where Isaac and Carrie are about to climb a very steep cliff, a very dangerous cliff, but under hostile conditions. And Carrie says, "We're about to make Ranger Rudder damn proud." I had chills when I read this because I actually just visited this exact location in Normandy where this scene he was referencing took place. And I was wondering if you could just tell us about this Ranger and what the story is behind there.
Yeah, absolutely. So full disclosure, if you read my books, there are a lot of jokes about Navy SEALs. And the reason for that is that the majority of my friends come from the Army Special Operations Command, and two of my closest friends were members of the Ranger Regiment. And so part of the Ranger Regiment's illustrious history is in World War II. And I'll tell one short story. The Rangers motto is Rangers lead the way. And that comes from a second event during Normandy where a general came up to the beach and said, "Who's in charge here? What unit is that?" And somebody yelled out, "75th Rangers." And he said, "Well, then, damn it, Rangers lead the way." And so that became kind of their rallying cry. Well, there was another incident in which the Rangers, as part of the Normandy invasion, there were these huge German artillery pieces that were situated on this place called Point du Hoc that had what they thought was this impossible climbable cliff. And so the Germans felt very safe there, and they were just pounding the crap out of Normandy Beach. And so in order to eliminate that, men from the Ranger Regiment scaled those cliffs under fire and then took out the guns and secured it to be able to save the landing or help safeguard the landing at Normandy. And so Ranger Rudder at the time was, I believe, a lieutenant colonel, was the battalion commander of those Rangers. He went on to be the president at Texas A&M. And so again, going back to my son's school, if you go to Texas A&M, there is a tower, Rudder Tower, that is the exact height of the cliffs at Point du Hoc as a tribute to him and the men he led during World War II. And so it's, if you know anybody from the special operations community, they're incredibly proud of their lineage and of their history. And so I thought that would be a really entertaining way to work in this piece of history from the Ranger Regiment.
Yeah, I loved it because your characters were very inspired by that courage. And if I remember correctly, didn't he scale that cliff with a knife?
Yeah, I'm sure
It was a sheer cliff.
Yeah.
He went up by one by one.
Yeah, they had so I don't know if he used the knife. He may have to scale the cliff, but if you look at her, you were at Point du Hoc, just trying to get up it would not have been an easy task. And then imagine trying to get up with 70 pounds of kit on your shoulders and Germans firing at you at the same time. And it was an incredible moment, but it was an incredible moment full of incredible moments. You know, if you look, not to geek out too bad on that invasion, but one of the reasons, you know, we've all watched Band of Brothers and the Easy Company folks, and one of the reasons they were so famous is during that operation, their drop got completely gone awry, where they were supposed to all land in one place. They were scattered all over the countryside. And so rather than, you know, giving up or saying, "Hey, we're going to try again later," they banded together in little groups, still went after their objective and still accomplished it, even though they were moving together with completely disparate set. And so you just think of what those men accomplished on that day to safeguard freedom for all the rest of us. It really is an incredible story.
Sure is.
It's a great story. And all of these little truths that you've woven into this fantastic book, for all of our listeners and our readers, you got to want to pick this book up. Weapons Grade. You're going to love it as much as Kristen and I did. We love what you're working on next. We're going to be looking forward to that next book. And I want to also tell for our listeners, please do connect with Don Bentley. You can find him on his webpage, donbentley.com. You can find him on Facebook, and you can find him on X, formerly known as Twitter. And it's been a lot of fun diving down deep with you today, Don. Very interesting, fascinating, and a lot of fun.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And just one quick correction, my website is donbentleybooks.com. So you almost had it, just one more word, but thank you so much for having me, guys.
I'm glad you corrected it. Have a great day. Hope to see you again in next year.
All right. Bye.
What an interesting discussion. I love these authors when they weave in these historical truths or something from a geopolitical angle. And he does that so deftly in the story. I mean, you learn a lot. You learn about the technology, and that's what we expect from the novels in this franchise. And he delivers.
He does. And, you know, I just really love these military stories too, because as he said in the end, even to this day, people are dedicating their lives and they're risking their lives for our freedom and our country. And there was one line in the book that I thought hit me. The president decided that this aircraft, Corvair, was going to war, and Bob's job was to facilitate the decision, not second guess it. So like, even as you said in Normandy, there were no other decisions. It was, we're landing, we're going, you're going to do it. And to be able to take away all of your fear or your any kind of selfish thought, it's a pretty tough thing, super courageous and very admirable.
Yeah, I agree. And again, going back to the other parts of the story where there's that heart too, he brings it down to that family level, to that individual level. And we see the development of this character in really, really cool ways, unexpected ways, but really cool ones.
And how did you feel about Jack Ryan Jr.? I thought it was cool. He was part of this. He was a CIA analyst. Then he was part of this campus team. He was the son of the president. But Don factored in and wove into this character something more than all of his resume qualifications. He had intellect and he had instinct. And you loved that guttural instinct in that character that almost made all of us think, hey, if he can do it, maybe I could rise to an occasion like this at some time.
Yes. And it also sharpened all of the character senses where their gut was telling them something was off, something wasn't right. And I loved how he wove in that detail too, where they started noticing something out of place or they picked up on a clue that really was something that would save them.
Yeah.
So it was very well done.
And the last thing I had to say is, so when you're talking about all this military equipment and all this delicate security systems and espionage, Bob said something. Minute adjustments to complex systems often yield unintended results. And it hit me, Murphy's Law. Like how many times in my life, even just setting up some type of a table I get in the mail and I have to add screws and everything, and I can't get that thing together because Murphy's Law is in play. One screw is missing. How much more so with an unmanned aircraft? We've all experienced it. The littlest, tiniest thing can throw everything awry in life. You know it too, probably.
Oh yeah. I'm thinking about trying to log on today.
Yes, so true. Well, anyway, everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Definitely pick up this book. It was fantastic. Don Bentley writing for Tom Clancy, Weapons Grade. And you're going to want to stay on the radar with Bookstorm Podcast. We got some great things ahead for the closing of our summer. Rebecca Yaros in Fourth Wing, Deneen Milner, One Blood, Jacqueline Machard, A Very Inconvenient Scandal, James Rowlands, Tides of Fire, Michael Ledwidge, The Girl in the Vault, and John Mars, The Vacation, all coming up.
Oh, I can't wait to talk about those. And listeners, we continue to grow every week. Thank you for sharing our socials. And we are in 68 countries in 1,300 cities across the world, all across the United States. I think we have 2 states where we don't have a listener, and we need those listeners. Alaska, hear us.
I think
We
it's
are
South
excited.
Dakota, the 2 states that are least populated, I might add. So we're still looking pretty good.
But we are thankful for all of you, and we want you to stay with us. Bookstormpodcast.com. You can listen to all of our past episodes. You can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, on TikTok, and of course on YouTube. Just search for Bookstorm and podcast, and we should come right up. Until next time, listeners, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.